The town did not know her name when she stepped off the coach at dusk, belly heavy and face pale as wood ash, and the dust seemed to cover her like someone the world meant to forget. In 1830 Ohio, the canal was still a scar in the earth. The church bell cracked from frost and grief was kept behind doors. She asked for a room, then for water, then for the doctor whose neat sign showed a cross. Dr. Elijah Crow appeared as a man people trusted. Clean collar, soft voice, a Bible close to his ledger. He took her wrist and listened as though her pulse carried secrets. He told the innkeeper's wife to send for the midwife, and he asked the townsman by the stove to make space, as if decency was another instrument he carried. The midwife came with her basket and said she had seen all kinds of births. She did not know Crow had already boiled a basin with a powder that stung like lye. When she dipped her hands, her skin burned and she hissed. Crow said that clean always hurt first. And the women at the door nodded because the word clean makes protest sound ungrateful. He moved the lamp so the light struck the woman's face, not the place where her pain gathered. The woman stared beyond the flame, lips parted as if someone unseen was calling her elsewhere. The room grew silent, waiting for the first push. A coachman swore later that he heard two labors at once, one in her body, one in the wall, like a shadow splitting. Those who stood near said her shadow peeled free against the lamp line, dragging itself with no breath. The midwife crossed herself, though she had never done so in church. Crow did not flinch. He gave orders and measures, told her where to press, how long to count, as though the human body were a clock he wound at will. The woman bit her lip until blood ran, and he wiped it away, not to soothe her, but to mark how color changed beneath his cloth. What came was not a child anyone could hold. There was weight on the sheet, iron in the air, and a smear that trembled like a body drawn by a shaking hand. Crow wrapped it in cloth, lifted nothing anyone else could see, and placed it in a box already waiting beneath the table. He told the room it was stillborn and that the mother must be kept warm or her heart would forget its duty. He ordered a boy to carry the box to the cellar door. The boy returned pale and whispered that the steps were slick. Crow set a hand on his shoulder and said some mercies were not for children. The midwife washed again, though her fingers had gone numb. She said she could no longer feel her nails. Crow told her to bind the mother first and feel later. The woman, eyes half closed, asked if anyone could speak her name back to her. No one answered. She drifted into sleep with her eyes still open. Crow sat at the bed's edge, opened his ledger, and made a mark that was half cradle, half trap. By morning, the church women carried broth and smiles that did not reach their eyes. Men struck their hammers at the mill as if noise could seal the night away. The midwife returned home with a red rash creeping up her arms, blisters rising like salt beneath skin. By sundown she burned with fever, and by dawn her tongue was gray. People called it winter sickness. Crow said sorrow moves in strange ways, and the pastor agreed because it sounded like wisdom. A boy from the county home who had fetched wood for Crow began to cough and drool, his lips cracked white. His voice dwindled to a rasp, as if something inside him had been rewired. The matron said the boy was fragile. Crow said fragile children tell the truth of medicine, and the words were repeated as if they explained anything at all. The town chose to be grateful. They thanked him for staying through the night, for guiding the stranger, for burying what had not lived so she would not have to carry that sight. He sent linens boiled white to the church and asked no coin. He walked the square with his hat in his hands, grief painted in the proper lines. At dusk, the woman stood at his upstairs window, hand pressed to the glass. She was alive, yet something behind her eyes had twisted like a key broken inside a lock. She held her belly, though it was flat, as if some second body remained, not flesh but story. Crow lit a lamp behind her, and the pain showed two of her once again. Down in the cellar, the box rested among others that smelled faintly of smoke and lime, each marked only by a date. Damp spread across the clay floor and crept toward a drain. Above ground, the town fed the midwife's widower, repeating the phrases that keep grief small. No one asked why the basin had burned her skin. No one asked why the boy's tongue stumbled. People said order was mercy, and mercy was the work of men like Crow. That night he sharpened his quill until it sang against the knife. He wrote the date again without a name and drew the small mark beside it. The cradle turned on its side, ready to be filled, ready to be closed. The house went quiet, the kind of quiet that waits, and the cracked church bell seemed to hold its breath. What had happened folded itself into memory as if it were always meant to be there. The ledger was bound in dark calfskin, edges rubbed smooth by years of use, and when Dr. Elijah Crow opened it, the pages breathed dust like a body sighing. The town thought it held lists of remedies and births, records of bleeding cups and fevers eased, but what lay inside was a cathedral of cruelty written in a physician's steady hand. He called it his study of imperfection. Each line marked not the growth of life, but its dismantling. Crow never wrote their names, only initials. Because names humanize and human warmth was an infection, he believed medicine must burn out. The woman from the quiet birth was there, not as mother but as specimen. He wrote that her belly, emptied of child, was a hollow suited for further shaping. He described the skin's elasticity, the way heat sealed wounds when applied with iron, and how ribs could be bound like branches so they would curl inward. He had seen drawings from Paris, crude sketches of cages made from bone, but he meant to make them real. His first subject was not the woman, but a farmhand who had broken his leg in the mill. Crow visited him at night, chloroform rag pressed to his mouth, and when the man awoke, his chest was wrapped in bands of metal heated until skin hissed. Crow did not mean for him to die, not yet. He forced him to breathe, to wheeze against his new frame, lungs scraping against rib ends. The man lived 6 days, each breath whistling sharp as wind through a keyhole, until the skin sloughed away and infection entered. Crow wrote in his ledger that the body had failed to adapt, but the idea was sound. The second subject was a child from the orphan home, chosen because small bones bend easily. Crow bound her chest with polished rods and tightened the screws each night, listening for the sound of her lungs straining against their own prison. He fed her broth and whispered that she was being remade for God, that she would be an angel who carried her own cage to heaven. She survived longer, long enough for the bones to curve inward, long enough for her eyes to turn yellow from trapped breath. When she died, he wrote with pride that the ribs had nearly kissed. The body was burned in his orchard pit, but the bones were kept, wired in place, displayed to no one but himself. Crow believed imperfection revealed divinity. He argued in his notes that God had left mistakes in flesh, open gaps for men like him to finish. He used the language of science, but always folded scripture into his lines, quoting the Psalms beside drawings of bent ribs. He wrote that the soul does not live in the body, so reshaping the body does not harm the soul. The cruelty was hidden behind reason. The ledger pages a mask for a sickness he never admitted aloud. Those who lived near his house sometimes heard the thin whistling at night. They thought it was the wind through the shutters, not knowing it was lungs pressed to bone, air leaking in tiny screams. Crow kept them alive as long as possible because he wanted to record the stages. The first panic when the chest would not expand, the delirium when blood lost its color, the moment the eyes turned glassy but still rolled with awareness. He wrote that these were the purest states of humanity, stripped of sin, made perfect by limitation. The townspeople saw only the doctor who offered penny cures and lent books to the pastor. They did not see the cellar where hooks lined the wall, each hook numbered to match an entry in the ledger. They did not smell the sour stench of boiled bone that clung to his clothes. Crow washed himself in vinegar before stepping into the street, so the odor became sharp cleanliness, and people praised his discipline. The truth hid in plain sight. Crow's mind was not one of rage, but of order. He did not strike in anger or shout when subjects cried. He moved with calm hands, like a priest adjusting vestments. This was why his cruelty reached further than any murderer's blade. He believed he was not killing but revealing, and belief makes monsters patient. Every mark in his ledger was written with steady letters, no blot, no tremor. To him, the deaths were not tragedies but measurements, numbers in the margin, proof that flesh could be bent until the soul was freed. One winter, he turned his iron bands on a woman who had come for a cough. He told her the treatment required restraint, that heat would draw out the sickness. She trusted him. When she realized what he had done, it was too late. Her chest was locked, breath shallow as a candle flame. Crow recorded her prayers word for word, writing that faith rose faster when lungs faltered. She died on the third night, and he wrote a neat script that the experiment confirmed his theory. God is most visible in suffering. The ledger grew thick. Pages warped with ink and oil from his hands. Each new victim was another line in his scripture of anatomy, another notch in his pursuit of order. He told himself the world outside was blind, that he alone could see how imperfect flesh yearned to be remade. At the bottom of one page, he wrote a sentence that explained nothing and everything. To cage the body is to free the design. And above ground, the town moved as if nothing shifted. The church bell rang, children played in the mud, and women washed clothes in the river, believing health was in the hands of a man whose very pen was an instrument of torture. They never saw how the ink bled when the candle guttered, how each word was a nail in a coffin no one dared to open. Crow closed the ledger, tied its strap, and placed it back on the shelf, waiting for the next patient, the next chance to record God's so-called correction. The silence around him was its own consent, and in that silence his work grew darker still. The cellar beneath Elijah Crow's home had no windows, no breath of outside air, only the faint smell of damp earth and smoke. It was not a place built for medicine but for ritual. Along the walls he had hung mirrors pried from a burned theater in Cincinnati, their glass warped by heat, their frames scorched and uneven. Each reflection bent a body into grotesque shapes, making noses swell, limbs twist, mouths gape into hollow circles. Crow saw in them not ruin but revelation. He called the room his chamber of separation, a place where the soul might finally be forced to peel away from the weakness of flesh. The mirrors alone would have unsettled any ordinary visitor, but Crow paired them with something worse: mercury. He had ordered jars of it through medical suppliers under the guise of treating venereal disease, though what he prepared was no cure. He drew it into syringes and pressed it beneath skin, sending the liquid metal coursing through veins. The body stiffened at once, skin tightening, color draining, until a strange sheen coated the flesh like damp lead. Victims would sit bound to a chair, watching themselves blacken in the glass, unable to look away. Crow would tilt their heads toward the mirrors, whispering that this was the moment when their real selves began to show. He told them the body was a garment that needed to be stripped by poison, and the mirror would reveal the soul, leaving its disguise. The first to suffer in this room was a debtor brought quietly from the jail. Crow convinced the magistrate that no one would miss him. The man fought the bindings, his fists blistering against the rope until the mercury slowed his blood. He stared into the mirror and gasped as his lips darkened, veins standing like black rivers beneath his skin. He begged for water, begged for release, but Crow only lifted the lamp higher, ensuring the reflection was clear. Hours passed with the man locked between life and death. The poison dragged him into convulsions, yet he did not die quickly. Crow scribbled notes as the man's jaw froze, describing how the mind seemed to break before the body. The man's final sound was not a scream, but a long hiss of breath, echoing back in the mirrors until it seemed like a chorus. Crow refined his practice with each victim. He adjusted doses, slowed the injection, prolonged the collapse so he could study every stage. Women brought in under the claim of fainting spells, orphans taken under the guise of treatment, all found themselves in the chair with glass on every side. Their own faces became instruments of torment. The warped reflections made their eyes stretch, their mouths gape wide until even they recoiled from themselves. Some tried to turn away, but Crow forced their heads straight with straps of leather. He wrote that shame was the key, that once a person recoiled from their own image, their soul began to unmoor. The mirrors became more than tools, they became companions to Crow. He lingered in the room after deaths, staring at the reflections of empty chairs, imagining the souls still caught in the glass. He believed the warped surfaces held fragments of those he had separated, and he began to talk softly to them, reading passages from scripture or from his ledger. The distortion comforted him. It proved in his mind that what he had done was not simple killing but transformation. The reflections seemed to nod with him, their bent smiles feeding his belief that he was not alone in his work. Each death was slow and calculated. Victims did not simply fall but decayed in stages. Their hair loosened in clumps. Gums bled until teeth rattled loose, eyes dulled into milky pools. And all the while they were forced to look at themselves becoming less human. Crow believed terror peaked not in pain but in recognition. When they finally understood that the reflection was both them and not them, something inside them cracked. He wrote that this fracture was the moment of separation, the precise point when the soul left the husk. The townspeople knew nothing of the chamber. They saw only the doctor who tipped his hat and spoke softly in the market. But those who lived near his house sometimes swore they heard faint cries in the night, not loud but drawn out, like voices trapped in wells. Crow dismissed such rumors as wind through the trees. In truth, the walls of the cellar held sound long after the throats that made it were gone. The psychological toll of his method was not confined to victims alone. The slow poisoning left imprints on Crow himself. His skin grew pale, hands trembling at times, a faint metallic taste forever on his tongue from handling mercury. Yet he saw this as a blessing, believing he too was slowly separating, joining the others who had passed through the mirrors. He considered his weakness proof of progress, his body becoming the very experiment he inflicted on others. He expanded the chamber further, collecting more mirrors, each more warped than the last. The room became a maze of reflections, every surface bending reality into nightmares. When victims were placed in the center, they no longer saw one face, but dozens, each screaming at a different angle, each version of themselves dying in its own way. Crow called this the choir of separation. He believed the soul multiplied in its departure, fragmenting across the glass, a holy scattering of what was once confined. The chamber of mirrors became his scripture written in flesh and reflection. The deaths it held were not accidents of cruelty, but deliberate rituals, each step meant to strip dignity, to force a person to watch themselves rot while alive. And Crow, calm and patient, believed this was mercy. He believed he was teaching them to abandon their imperfect shells, to see themselves as something beyond the cage of skin. He left the room each night with ink stains on his fingers and the scent of mercury in his breath, convinced the mirrors had blessed him with another fragment of eternity. Above ground, the town slept. They trusted the man who carried the Bible and walked with quiet steps. But beneath his house, The chamber whispered with echoes of those who had been forced to meet their own decay. In every distorted reflection, Crow saw himself multiplied, and in each version he smiled back, certain he was building not hell, but a sanctuary. The chamber was not finished, it was only waiting for its next subject. Elijah Crow understood that the body was not only a cage of ribs or a canvas of flesh, it was also an instrument. Where others heard voices as prayers or songs, he heard them as raw material, vibrations that could be bent and tuned. The orphans were his supply, taken in small numbers so that no one in the county would notice all at once. A cart came each month to deliver flour to the home, and Crow rode with it, offering free checkups for the children. He smiled, pressed coins into the matron's palm, and promised medicine. Then he selected a child who coughed or limped or stared too long at the floor, and he carried them away under the excuse of treatment. The home was glad to see its burdens reduced. No one asked where the children went. Beneath the town church was a stone crypt once meant for storing coffins during winter. Crow converted it into a rehearsal hall. The walls sweated with damp, and the air carried the smell of mold and earth. But to him, it was perfect. He removed the tongues of each child with precision, suturing the wounds so they would not bleed to death. He kept the severed flesh in jars of lye stacked neatly on a shelf, each jar labeled with a letter as if it were part of a musical scale. He did not want their silence, he wanted their hum. A mouth without a tongue could not form words, but it could produce low vibrations, moans stretched into tones. Crow arranged them in rows, sat them on wooden benches, and tapped his cane until their voices blended into a hollow drone. At first the sound was chaos, a wet buzzing of throats struggling to obey. But Crow persisted, beating rhythm with the heel of his boot, raising and lowering his hands as though conducting a sacred rite. Slowly the children learned. He trained them to sustain notes until their faces reddened, then to stagger their breaths so the hum never stopped. He believed he was sculpting not music, but proof that the human body could be remade into a single organ of sound. He wrote in his ledger that the earth itself groans in this pitch, and he meant to draw that buried resonance into flesh. The punishments were part of the ritual. If a child faltered or fell out of tune, he brought forth a jar with their own excised flesh, softened by the sting of lye, and forced them to swallow it. The act broke something inside them more than pain alone could. They understood their voices were no longer their own, that even their discarded parts could be turned against them. Some gagged, some convulsed, but Crow made sure none died too soon. Death was not the point. The point was discipline, the shaping of fear into obedience. Each failure added another jar to his shelf, each jar another step in his scale. When they sang together in the crypt, the sound carried through the church floor. The pastor and townsfolk mistook it for the settling of stone, the groaning of earth beneath the building. They prayed louder when it came, thinking the land itself was aching for God's mercy. Crow watched from the shadows, listening as his hidden choir swelled. Convinced he had bent the voices of children into the voice of the earth itself. He smiled during sermons, his Bible open, while the hum rose beneath his feet like a hidden hymn. The deaths came eventually, not by design, but by the strain of bodies worn thin. A boy who had been forced to swallow too much of himself convulsed until his throat collapsed. A girl hummed until her lungs bled and her chest filled with dark froth. Crow recorded their ends with the detachment of a conductor noting when an instrument cracked. He buried their remains in the churchyard under the guise of charity. The town, believing he had offered them sanctified rest. He told himself that their voices did not end with their bodies. They lingered in the resonance of the crypt, trapped in the stone, vibrating still. For the children who survived, existence became a blur of sound and punishment. Their hums were not cries of sorrow anymore, but reflexes, tones beaten into them until they could not stop. They sat in rows, heads tilted, mouths trembling without words, only vibrations. Their eyes grew vacant, their spirits hollow. Crow saw this vacancy as victory. He believed he had tuned them into instruments of pure will, stripped of individuality, stripped of language, reduced to resonance. The psychological toll of the silent choir extended beyond the crypt. The pastor confessed that he sometimes woke at night to hear a low vibration beneath his bed, a sound that reminded him of stone splitting in winter. Women in the town whispered that the church groaned louder each year, that the walls seemed to shake during evening prayers. They did not know they were hearing children breaking beneath the floorboards. They thought it was God, heavy with judgment, pressing down on their sanctuary. Crow alone knew the truth, and he cherished it. He believed he had captured not just voices, but the essence of humanity's broken chorus. The silent choir was not an accident of cruelty, but a deliberate reworking of creation. Each child was a note, each punishment a sharpening, each death a necessary silence. And above all, Crow saw himself not as monster but maestro, conducting a hymn no one else was worthy to hear. When he closed the crypt door at night, the hum continued, long and low, like the earth moaning in grief. Crow walked home with his Bible tucked beneath his arm and his ledger waiting by candlelight. To the town, he remained the good doctor. To himself, he was the keeper of voices that had been torn from children and fed back into their own bodies, a cycle of sound and silence that no one else dared imagine. The choir would sing again tomorrow, and the earth would groan with them. Sarah Whitcomb's name appeared once in the parish ledger of 1832, recorded beside a marriage entry. A note in faded ink mentioned a celebration, a small feast, a promise of a new household. Yet no record followed of children born, land purchased, or death declared. Her name stopped on the page as if it had been erased by something other than time. People whispered that she had run west, or that her new husband had been careless and let her slip into the river. But the truth had not left the town at all. It was sealed in stone beneath Crow's hand. Crow had watched the wedding from a distance, standing in the shade of the churchyard trees with a Bible tucked under his arm. He noted the softness of her voice, the unsteady happiness that trembled when she repeated her vows. He saw in her not a wife but a specimen, a body yet untouched by motherhood, still pliant, still perfect for ritual. When the evening grew late and lanterns sputtered, Sarah vanished from the square. The groom staggered home drunk, and no one saw her enter Crow's gate. She descended into silence, taken into the cellar where his experiments became ceremonies. The stone coffin had been carved from a single block, smooth on the inside, lid heavy enough to block light and air. Crow fitted it with an iron funnel that pressed against her lips, its narrow stem locked into place so she could not turn her head. Into that funnel he dripped melted wax drop by drop until it cooled in her throat. At first the wax hardened shallow, choking her until he poured heated oil to soften it and force it deeper. Day by day he returned, adding more, building layers until her neck stiffened and her body froze into rigidity. He did not mean for her to die quickly. He wanted her to transform slowly, her flesh preserving itself around the candle he made of her own airway. Sarah thrashed in the early days, wrists bleeding against iron cuffs, tears running down her cheeks as she tried to spit against the wax. But the funnel allowed only intake, not release. Her protests weakened as each drip took her breath further, her throat narrowing to silence. Crow wrote in his ledger that she was becoming a vessel of light without flame, and he recorded each stage as if it were a sacred progression. Her husband searched the roads for a week, then drank himself into bitterness, muttering that she had abandoned him. The town pitied him, never knowing she lay just beneath their feet, her body hardening inch by inch under the doctor's careful hand. By the third week her eyes had glazed, pupils dull yet still aware, trapped in a body that could not move. Crow draped her in white cloth, not to comfort her, but to display her purity to those who would come. He invited visiting elites, judges, scholars, wealthy men curious about the unseen corners of medicine, to his cellar. They descended with lanterns and held their breath at the sight of her rigid form. Her lips sealed around iron, her body arched like marble sculpture. Crow called her his preserved bride, proof that flesh could be turned into monument rather than decay. The men whispered in awe, some horrified, some enthralled, but none reported what they saw. Complicity was the cost of admission. Sarah's body did not rot. The wax sealed her from air, her throat hardened into a column, her limbs fixed as if time itself had stopped. Crow had achieved what he long desired, a body that defied nature by becoming artifact. Yet the price was not only hers. Each man who looked on her carried away a sickness of the mind, a knowledge too heavy to speak aloud. They returned to their homes and stared at their wives with unease, seeing in them not companions but fragile shapes that could be transformed. Crow's evil spread like contagion, hidden not in wounds, but in thought. The torture had been methodical, drawn out not for spectacle but for order. Crow believed Sarah's suffering proved the body could be shaped into permanence. He recorded her as the bride who never left, a title he repeated as prayer. To him, she was no longer Sarah, but a symbol, a figure that gave weight to his twisted theory that life must be controlled into stillness. The psychological toll was his triumph. He wanted her eyes to remain open in that coffin, forever reflecting terror that could not be released. To him, those eyes were the truest scripture he had ever written. When her husband finally died years later, a broken man, Crow noted it as a footnote in his ledger. He did not care for the grief left behind. Grief was weakness, an imperfection he sought to erase. Sarah remained in her stone coffin long after, her body stiff and preserved, a candle never lit, yet never consumed. Crow would descend alone some nights, sitting beside her with quill in hand, murmuring to the frozen figure as though she were answering. He told her she was the proof that God's mistakes could be corrected, that marriage was not a covenant but a capture. He believed she had given him permission by her silence. Above ground, the town spoke less and less of Sarah Whitcomb until her name faded. In church, her absence was explained as abandonment, her disappearance a wound covered with gossip. Only Crow remembered her, and he remembered her not as bride but as object, a testament to his control. Her death was not only a killing but a conversion, one that advanced his philosophy of flesh made into relic. Each visitor who looked on her carried away a shard of that philosophy, whether in horror or admiration, and in this way her suffering spread further than her life ever had. Crow did not think of her as gone. He thought of her as eternal. To him, the wax had not suffocated her. It had reshaped her into permanence. He saw her body as scripture and her silence as agreement. She was the bride who never left because she was never allowed to leave, locked forever between life and death, a candle in flesh, proof that horror could be mistaken for holiness if delivered with calm hands and a physician's smile. Elijah Crow's hunger for order did not stop at bones or voices or the stiffened body of a bride. He turned next to the very river of life itself, the blood that carried warmth and memory through flesh. He had read of European surgeons who drained patients in theaters, their demonstrations celebrated as science. But Crow did not want an audience of doctors. He wanted the silence of his cellar where he alone could decide the rhythm of life and death. He built copper basins to catch the flow, polished until they gleamed like suns in the lamplight. Above them he suspended his subjects by their ankles, ropes cutting into skin, veins bulging in the upside-down strain. He opened their veins with a cut so clean it made hardly a sound, and the blood streamed into the basin like rain. The first moments were always panic. Faces turned red, eyes bulged, and gasps rattled through throats that could not understand why the world had inverted. Crow stood calm, quill in hand, measuring the flow, counting the drops until the basin rippled dark. He never let them bleed to death. He wanted to see what happened when the body was pushed to the brink and then pulled back again. When the basin filled, he cooled the blood with ice he harvested from winter rivers and packed in straw. The liquid thickened, turned sluggish, heavy as syrup. Then, with hands steady as prayer, he funneled it back into their veins, drop by slow drop, forcing the body to drink itself once more. The effect was chaos hidden in stillness. Muscles jerked against the ropes, seizures rippling like storms beneath skin. Victims' eyes rolled back until only white showed, yet their mouths tried to form words. Some muttered half-dreams, speaking names that no one else could hear. Others cried that they saw themselves standing beside their own bodies, looking down with pity. Crow recorded these visions with the care of a priest noting revelations. He believed the soul slipped loose in those moments, hovering at the edge, and he thought he was the one who had forced it free. He called it the bloodless hour, the point at which the body had been emptied and the soul had nothing left to cling to. Not all survived the return. The cooled blood shocked the heart, stopped at mid-beat, leaving the victim limp, pale, expressionless. Crow examined the corpses with fascination, noting the absence of fear in their final faces. He saw in them a purity, as if terror had been bled out along with the warmth. He buried them in pits at the edge of the forest, unmarked, returning each body to the earth without prayer. The soil there grew dark and damp, heavy with a smell that lingered long after the pits were covered. Those who did survive staggered through a waking nightmare. Their skin turned gray, their voices slurred, and they shook with visions that would not leave. One boy whispered for hours that he had walked around himself, watching his own heart beat from outside his chest. A woman wept until her eyes swelled shut, claiming she had seen her dead mother waiting with open arms, only to vanish when Crow forced the blood back into her. They never lived long. Their organs failed within days, their minds shattered beyond repair. Crow called them incomplete experiments, failures of the flesh rather than failures of his method. He refined his process with each attempt. He varied the height of suspension, the size of the copper basins, the time he left them drained before returning the flow. He wrote that too long caused death, too short produced nothing but faintness. The balance was delicate, a line between absence and return. Crow believed that line was where God's secret hid, and he meant to walk it over and over until it yielded. His quills dulled from the pressure of his notes, and his fingers were stained dark from ink and dried blood alike. The methodical cruelty did more than kill, it bent minds. The few who escaped his cellar, stumbling through the town before dying days later, carried whispers of what they had seen. They described the copper gleam, the ropes, the sensation of floating free from themselves. Those who heard them thought they were raving from fever, not knowing the fever was induced, not natural. Their words spread unease, a vague fear that something beneath their feet was draining the very essence of life. Crow himself bore the toll of his work. Handling the thickened blood left his skin clammy, his breath short, yet he welcomed the weakness. He believed he too was entering the bloodless hour, sharing in the visions he had forced on others. He sometimes stood before a mirror, tilting his head, wondering if his reflection would step out and take his place. He dreamed of basins filling endlessly, a flood that would wash all imperfection from the world. He woke with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, smiling faintly, convinced it was a sign. Each death was not an accident, but a note in his progression. He saw the drained bodies as steps toward a revelation only he could grasp. Their methodical suffering, their seizures and visions proved to him that life was malleable, that the soul could be made to hover in the palm of his hand if the body was emptied enough. He buried them not in shame, but in ritual, each pit another page in his unwritten scripture. Above ground the forest grew quiet, roots twisting into soil enriched by death. Below ground, Crow prepared his basins again, waiting for the next body to hang, the next hour to bleed dry. Judge Silas Pembroke had long been considered a pillar of order in the county. He sat on the bench with a solemn face, quoting scripture alongside law, handing down sentences that made men tremble and women nod with relief. Yet beneath that air of authority lay rot, and when Elijah Crow drew him into the cellar to show what lay below, the judge saw not crime, but opportunity. Crow revealed the coffins, the basins, the mirrors warped with the faces of the dead, and Pembroke did not recoil. He weighed it as if weighing coin, calculating where silence could become profit. Medical schools in Philadelphia paid for bodies, always hungry for subjects to dissect. Transporting corpses from graveyards carried risk, but here was a source no one would trace. Pembroke agreed to send the remains, arranging wagons under false names, earning gold for each shipment. Crow's victims, stripped of life and dignity, became currency. Families who asked where their children or kin had gone were told they had taken wagons west, chasing the frontier like so many others. Paperwork was forged, records adjusted, and silence closed over the truth like dirt over a grave. The judge told himself he was serving progress. Science needed bodies and the town needed peace. To expose Crow would be to unravel both. Better, he reasoned, to profit quietly, to let suffering be hidden if it could feed knowledge and power. But complicity is never clean. It stains deeper with each decision. Pembroke's silence turned to endorsement when Crow offered him more than coin. He offered revenge. The judge had a rival, a lawyer who had challenged his rulings, accused him of corruption, threatened his seat on the bench. Pembroke had hated him in the way only men of power hate those who threaten their throne. When Crow whispered that this rival could be delivered into his hands, the judge hesitated only long enough to taste the bitterness of his own fear. Then he nodded, sealing his fate as well as the man's. The rival was taken under cover of night, bound in ropes soaked in salt. Crow had devised this method with care, knowing salt is both preservative and destroyer. The fibers cut deeper with each movement, each breath scraping skin raw, each struggle grinding salt into the wounds. The flesh peeled in ribbons, curling like parchment until bone glistened beneath. Crow explained to Pembroke that this was not simple torture, but a lesson. The body stripped itself when placed under the right tension. The judge watched, sweat on his brow as his rival writhed, blood mingling with salt to form a paste that stung like fire. The screams filled the chamber until the throat gave out, leaving only a rasp that echoed off the mirrors. Crow did not kill him swiftly. He let the ropes do the work, tightening as muscles swelled, tearing skin layer by layer. The man lasted hours, delirium setting in, eyes rolling in silent pleas toward Pembroke, who stood by and said nothing. The moment of death came not with a cry, but with a slow collapse, the body folding into itself, bone showing through strips of ruined flesh. Crow recorded each stage while the judge sealed his own damnation by watching without intervention. Afterward, Pembroke buried his conscience under law. He told himself his rival had been taken by bandits, vanished on the road. No questions were raised. Too many in the town were willing to believe the easy lie of disappearance. Pembroke's silence became armor, but also a chain. From that night forward, he was bound to Crow. He had tasted complicity too deeply to turn back. The victims multiplied, their bodies drained, burned, or stiffened, and always Pembroke signed the papers that erased them. Families mourned in whispers, unsure whether to believe the stories of migration. Each death served both men. Crow refined his rituals while Pembroke grew rich. Yet beneath their gain lay an unspoken truth. They had remade the town itself into an accomplice. Each silence, each refusal to question was part of the same court that would not speak. The psychological toll gnawed at Pembroke in private. He began to dream of ropes tightening around his own limbs, salt eating into his skin, his rival's eyes burning into him. He woke with the taste of brine on his lips, convinced he had swallowed some part of the man's agony. By day, he steadied his hands on the bench, pronouncing judgment on petty thieves and drunkards, all the while knowing greater crimes lay in his cellar. He had become both judge and criminal, condemning others while his own silence kept worse horrors alive. Crow, however, felt no guilt. To him, the alliance proved his philosophy. Power was not only in the knife or the funnel or the rope. It was in silence, in the willingness of others to look away. Pembroke's compliance was his greatest experiment yet, proof that even law could be reshaped into complicity. The court itself became another of his instruments, humming with the same low tone as the silent choir, vibrating with unspoken acceptance of cruelty. The deaths were not accidents but demonstrations, each one methodical, each one advancing Crow's theory that suffering revealed truth. The salt ropes, the drained basins, the stiffened bodies, all of it fed into a pattern that grew darker with each entry in his ledger. Pembroke knew it, and still he did nothing. The judge who once spoke for justice now spoke only in lies, and his silence was louder than any verdict. At night, when the church bell cracked the silence, townsfolk stirred uneasily in their beds. They felt something pressing on them, a weight in the dark, though they could not name it. What they sensed was the truth rotting beneath their feet, protected by law, sealed by silence. Crow's work thrived because of it, and the court that should have spoken against him became the very shield that allowed him to continue. She returned when no one expected her, walking barefoot down the rutted road at dawn, her dress torn and stiff with dried blood, her skin gray with exhaustion. Years had passed since the night of her strange confinement, the night her shadow seemed to split and Crow declared the birth stillborn. People had forgotten her face, replaced memory with rumor. Yet when she appeared again, the town froze in silence. Her ribs jutted through skin that had once scarred over but now gaped open, raw as though her body had been carved and forced to heal only to be carved again. Each breath whistled through the broken cage of bone, her chest no longer shaped by nature but by the same iron logic that had twisted so many others beneath Crow's hand. She whispered to the first farmer who saw her that she had delivered herself twice. The words fell from cracked lips like scripture gone wrong. She spoke without urgency, as if she had rehearsed the phrase until it was the only truth she had left. Her belly was not rounded with life but sunken, a cavity that bulged strangely beneath her dress. When she stumbled and fell, the cloth tore further and revealed the hollow where her womb should have been. Inside were ashes pressed together like clay, scraps of paper etched with Crow's handwriting, and bones too small to be her own. They rattled when she moved, as if her body had become a reliquary built by another's cruelty. The townspeople recoiled. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers, but none stepped forward to touch her. She had become more than victim. She was evidence that breathed. The ashes and bones inside her were not accident, but placement, ritual inserted into flesh. Crow had hollowed her out and filled her with the remains of others, turning her into a vessel of testimony and torment. She carried in her own body the proof of the horrors no one dared to name aloud. Crow did not deny her return. When questioned, he spoke softly, telling the pastor and the magistrate that she was unstable, that childbirth had broken her mind and body alike. He said she wandered because she could not accept loss, and he urged compassion. His calm voice soothed the frightened, and again silence closed over the truth. Yet in his ledger he wrote of her as the woman who bore absence twice. He described the process with precision. How the ribs were spread, how the cavity was cleared, how the ashes of failed experiments and fragments of another skeleton were placed within her. He recorded it not as torture, but as completion. To him, she had been remade into symbol, a living altar that carried within her both the failed and the perfected. Her suffering was not only physical. Each step she took through the town was burdened by the eyes of others. Mothers pulled their children away, men avoided her path, and whispers followed her like shadows. She was alive, but her life had been turned into a spectacle of horror, a reminder that flesh could be used as vessel, that a woman could be stripped of identity and remade into a container for another's philosophy. The psychological toll etched itself into her posture. She walked hunched, arms pressed to her sides as though trying to hold herself closed. At night she was heard murmuring to the bones within her belly, calling them by names she invented, names that may once have been hers. Crow visited her in secret, not to heal but to observe. He watched as she coughed up flakes of ash, as ink from the scraps of paper stained her lips when the cavity shifted. He wrote that she was becoming a book that read itself aloud, her body leaking testimony with each movement. He believed she was the ultimate proof of his work, not a corpse buried in silence, but a living relic forced to carry the evidence of what had been done. She horrified the town, yet the town remained silent, for to speak against her condition was to speak against the doctor who claimed to protect them. Her body began to fail. The cavity widened, ribs snapping under the strain of weight they were never meant to carry. Infection set in, but still she walked, as though driven by a purpose no one else could see. She wandered to the churchyard, stood among the graves, and declared that she was both mother and child, both victim and evidence, both alive and already buried. The pastor fled from her words. The magistrate turned away, and again no one intervened. Their silence was her second death, heavier even than the bones inside her. When she collapsed at last near the forest edge, children found her body. They said she had been praying to the ground, her hands pressed into soil as if she meant to dig her own grave. Her body broke open when they tried to lift her, spilling ashes, paper, and bone into the dirt. The children screamed, and the townsfolk who came after ordered the remains buried at once, hidden from sight. Crow wrote nothing more of her in his ledger beyond a single line. Delivered into earth, her burden returned. He did not call it murder. He called it completion. Her death did not free the town. It stained it deeper. For years afterward, people claimed to see her shadow crossing the road at dusk, carrying nothing but emptiness within. Mothers told their daughters not to wander alone, not for fear of bandits, but for fear of becoming vessel. Her image became warning and curse, proof that silence allows evil not only to live, but to breed itself within the body of the innocent. She was no longer simply the woman who gave birth to herself. She was the woman who proved that horror can be carried in the womb of silence and delivered again and again until someone dares to speak. The silence could no longer hold. Years of whispered unease, of missing children, of strange sounds beneath the church floor swelled into anger too heavy for the town to bury. It began with a single scream when the woman who gave birth to herself collapsed in the forest. Her body spilling bones and ashes broke the last thread of denial. The pastor who had turned away, The magistrate who had profited, the mothers who had pretended not to hear, the weight of their silence turned to rage. Torches were lit not for guidance but for destruction. The crowd marched to Crow's house, their steps heavy, their faces set, a mob born not of courage but of fear that could no longer hide. Crow's home sat at the orchard's edge, rows of apple trees dark against the sky. The windows were shuttered, the rooms inside still, but the air around the house felt charged, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The townsfolk poured lamp oil on the porch, smashed the glass, and lit the fire. Flames climbed greedily, swallowing curtains and books, cracking beams, painting the orchard with red light. They believed destruction would end what had festered. Yet fire does not cleanse when the rot runs deep. It reveals. As the blaze spread into the orchard, the ground collapsed in places where Crow had dug pits. The earth split and revealed cages of iron buried beneath the trees, cages that had been hidden by soil and silence. Inside them were bodies, each arranged with care, not sprawled but posed in prayer. Their fingers, fused together by streams of molten lead, formed grotesque gestures of devotion. Some skulls still bore expressions of terror, mouths frozen open as if their last breath had been stolen mid-plea. The fire did not erase them. It burned away the earth that concealed them, exposing horror that could not be ignored. The orchard became a graveyard, its soil blackened by fire and by the truth it unearthed. Iron cages emerged, bodies frozen in prayer, fingers fused with lead. The stench lingered for weeks, creeping into homes and dreams, while whispers claimed the moans never ceased. Crow vanished, leaving only warped mirrors that reflected not his victims but the town's guilt. Families swallowed grief. Lawmakers in Ohio passed statutes in the name of progress, and medical men quietly cited fragments of his ledger, forgetting the screams behind the ink. The woman who gave birth to herself became parable, a warning that silence breeds horror. The town carried its shame in hushed stories, its orchard left a scar. Crow's legacy was not his name, but the lesson he proved, that evil thrives in silence, and when people choose quiet over truth, the soil is ready to grow it again.